Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm Chris Bianchi and joined by 9 News Sports Director Rod Mackey for a look at the busy Broncos. Busy, probably not in the best of senses, but they certainly are busy at this point, and we expect them to be on the busy side over the next few weeks. So, obviously, the Broncos making big news yesterday, firing head coach Vic Fangio after 3 seasons. There's a lot of questions about what's going to happen with ownership during this offseason as well. So, Rod, wanted to bring you in for a bit more insight of all that is going on around Dove Valley. And Rod, I want to start things off by taking a look at Vic Fangio, who gets fired after 3 years. There was some questioning leading up to it, whether or not it was going to happen. What do you think led to that decision by general manager George Payton?
I mean, the bottom line is, Chris, is that the Broncos just weren't winning. They haven't been winning. They weren't just bad; they were boring. I know a lot of people said, "Oh, we weren't sure this was going to happen." It seemed for a while like this was really a no-brainer. This is something Denver had to do. Now, yesterday, both Joe Ellis and George Payton agreed that this was an organizational issue. You can't point all the fingers at the head coach, but you can't fire the organization. You have to get rid of individuals. You have to make changes. This is something Denver had to do. They had to make a change. They had to kind of get some new passion for this. I mean, you've had 10,000 plus no-shows game after game at Mile High. The Broncos losing at home. The Broncos losing over and over again to AFC West foes. Something's got to change. Obviously, a big reason for this is the quarterback, yes, and the Broncos will need to find a new QB. That's for certain. It's no longer defense wins championships in the NFL. It's now quarterbacks win championships, and they'll get to that eventually. But first things first, they just had to fire Vic Fangio. Just something that had to be done. You had to make some kind of a move. You can't keep doing this. I mean, that's 5 straight seasons with losing records, 6 years in a row now since way back in 2015. Had they made it to the playoffs, that's of course when they won the Super Bowl with Peyton Manning. You had to do something, and on Saturday they lost their game. That was 4 straight setbacks, and then yesterday on Sunday, George Payton made the call to get rid of Vic Fangio.
And now the Broncos rumored to be in the mix for several different potential coaching candidates. They requested permission to interview people like Eric Bieniemy, the ECU legend, of course, now the Kansas City Chiefs offensive coordinator, Dan Quinn, as well with the Dallas Cowboys. Maybe some time until they're able to interview some of these candidates. But Rod, where did the Broncos stand overall in that coaching search?
Yeah, right now at 2:22 on January 10th, we are up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates that they have reached out to have a conversation with. It sounds like they're going to try to interview in all, maybe around 10. I know yesterday they said it was 9, but they seem to be adding some. I mean, with Brian Flores getting fired by Miami today, would not be surprised at all if that's a gentleman they reached out to. They had talked to him before. So right now it's Bieniemy, Hackett, Moore, Quinn, and Mayo are the 5 that the Broncos have reached out to. But again, that could change any moment. It seems every time you refresh Twitter or Mike Kliss gets a hold of us, they are adding another candidate to talk to. George Payton said yesterday, side of the ball, offense, defense, doesn't really matter. Head coaching experience, no coaching experience, that doesn't matter. They're going to kind of look at this with an open book, open arms, kind of see who's out there, seeing who impresses them. And it worked for George for players. This rookie draft class is one of the best that the Broncos have had, certainly for the best they've had in a long, long time. So we'll see what that happens with the head coaching search. But some of, as you mentioned, Chris, some they can talk to sooner rather than later. It depends on where these teams are in the playoffs. And there's others like Doug Peterson, who was not working last year, who's not on this list yet, that you think would be on eventually. So the Broncos compiling a long list, a very impressive list as you look at these. You mentioned EB, the former CU Buff. I hope if Denver doesn't get him, you hope this is a year that he finally gets a shot. Certainly well deserved.
You mentioned that they're not saying, at least publicly, that they're going to favor one side of the ball or the other, but you mentioned how the Broncos have been not only losing, but doing it in kind of a boring fashion over the last few years. And again, I know this is a little bit speculative, but wouldn't you think there would be a lean towards the offensive side of the ball?
If you got a guy who's defensive minded, like Dan Quinn, for instance, you rely on Dan Quinn to bring in a strong offensive coordinator. Vic Fangio didn't do that with Pat Shurmur. Pat Shurmur was kind of old school offense. You saw how boring the Broncos were, and obviously Teddy Bridgewater, not the most dynamic quarterback. Drew Lock is, but could make mistakes. So I think they toned him down a little bit. So you bring in a guy with a defensive mind, you're going to rely on him to bring in an offensive coordinator who has a tremendous upside. And then, of course, the key to the whole thing is getting that quarterback. That'll be issue number 2, which yesterday George was pressed about it. It could be issue number 1, but you can't get a quarterback now. You can get a coach now. So that's why first you get your coach and then you get your quarterback. A lot of people think Nathaniel Hackett would be coming to Colorado because maybe that could entice Aaron Rodgers, but you don't want to just bring him in thinking he might be able to bring in the Packers QB, because if that doesn't happen and you're not bringing him in for his skill set, then why'd you bring him in?
And by the way, telling to me that in Vic Fangio, what turned out to be his final press conference back on Saturday after they lost the Chiefs, pretty directly saying that the Broncos don't have the quarterbacks to really keep up with the AFC West, saying that the other 3 teams in the AFC West just simply have better quarterbacks. I don't know. I don't remember seeing that kind of bluntness that often, but kind of broadening the picture. So we know that the coaching staff, the quarterback situation has to be addressed. Ownership has to be addressed as well this offseason. And I wonder, Rod, if that also plays into the coaching search with the uncertainty surrounding ownership, if potential candidates are going, should I go to Denver or not?
2 things on that. First, let's get back to what you talked about with Vic's comments about the quarterbacks. Yeah, very, very honest and very true, but very surprising to say. You don't want to throw your guys under the bus, and that's really what Vic did in that instance. I guess he probably knew he had one foot out the door and did that. But yeah, Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater not compared to Derek Carr and Justin Herbert and, of course, Patrick Mahomes. Just strange that he would say that. As far as the ownership, Joe Ellis made it clear yesterday that he's still not willing or ready or able to talk about ownership with things still in the courts. He said as soon as he is able to, he will address that. We all believe there'll be new ownership by the time the Broncos kick off next season. George Paton asked about that. Would that affect a coach? Because a coach looks at this team and says, wait a minute, do I want to go to a team who doesn't have an owner? Let's say the owner comes in and he says, I want this guy as the head coach. Well, George Paton had to deal with that last year as well, knowing that ownership was still in flux, and yet he made the move. He's got a contract. The coach is going to get a contract. So asked about it yesterday, both Joe Ellis and George Paton said they don't believe that ownership would have a negative effect on bringing a quality coach, the coach they're looking for here to Denver.
Without being overly prying on this, Rod, do you believe that?
I mean, I think human nature is I would be concerned if I'm looking at going to Miami or going to Denver and Miami has a more firm ownership in place. You wonder if you would lean towards Miami, just to use that as an example. But again, you're going to talk to the general manager. You're going to talk to George and you're going to see what he has to say. So yeah, it could play a part. I mean, human nature makes you think, well, there's a question mark there, but again, I guess I'm gonna probably rely on what George has to say than what I have to say, because to me it seems like, yeah, it would play some sort of factor. But if George Paton, the way he explained it, he's gone through this. I think it would if it gets down to being that close, but you just hope if the Broncos have a guy that they really want. For instance, the Bears have a guy. The coach looks at Chicago, looks at Denver, looks at all the pieces in place here, how close they could be, especially if they get a QB, then he does decide to go with the Broncos.
So if the Broncos are potentially, hypothetically, a coach, an owner, and a quarterback away from getting there, what else do we have to watch for this offseason? The Broncos have a lot of cap room, about $50 million in cap room, 11 draft picks coming up. So, maybe been a little bit negative here in what we've said so far, understandably, coming off of the 7-10 year and 6 straight losing seasons. But there are a lot of things to like as well here, Rod, as well, right?
There are. I mean, like I mentioned, that rookie draft class is great. They've got a strong defense, that is for sure. And I don't know if they're an owner, a coach, and a quarterback away. I mean, when you've gone 6 years in a row without making the playoffs, to think that they make these changes and all of a sudden jump back into the Super Bowl, that might be quite a stretch. Now, the playoffs is certainly realistic. Again, Denver's going to play a last place schedule. You look at the opponents they're going to have next season, and on paper, it really sets up well for Denver. Although this year they played a last place schedule, started off 3-0, and then everything kind of fell apart a little bit, and they finished under 500 yet again. So there are pieces in place. There are a lot of positives about this place, but changes have to be made, and we'll see. We'll see who that coach is. We'll see who that quarterback is, and eventually we'll see what happens with Broncos ownership. There are good things here, but let's they're not the Kansas City Chiefs. They're not the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're still ways away from some of those teams. But I think you see the progress. They all talked on Saturday and Sunday about the foundation being in place. There are some good pieces there, just not the biggest pieces, and just not enough. Not right now.
Not right now, but well, it's going to be a busy offseason. I mean, boy, owner, coach, possible quarterback. You would think they're going to do something quarterback, and again, a lot of draft picks and a lot of.
It can't be possible. Have to have a quarterback. You got to do something. I would address it both in the draft and in free agency. Just don't believe that Teddy and Drew are the answers. It's a quarterback league. You gotta try to somehow get somebody. Unfortunately, this year, unlike some of these years past, the depth in the draft at the quarterbacks not what it's been. So it looks like the free agent route is that. Of course, Aaron Rodgers is the dream for everyone. Don't know how realistic that is. Russell Wilson, his name has been mentioned many times, although Pete Carroll said again today that Seattle has no plans. He's our quarterback, I think was Carroll's quote today. So we'll see. Again, we're only on January 10th, so there's a lot of time. But you got to get a quarterback. You have to get a quarterback. You just have to.
Maybe you'll be one of us, Rod. Who knows? Maybe we'll sling it.
Then all of a sudden 7-10 would sound great.
Yeah, at this point, might as well get that number one pick. But anyways, well, Rod Mackey, 9 News Sports Director, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for checking in with us after a busy weekend for the Broncos, finishing 7-10, 6 straight losing season. But hopefully things, well, a lot of change coming, and hopefully that'll lead to better years ahead for the Broncos. But Rod, thanks so much for your time.
You bet, Chris.
All right, have a good one. Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch.